All right, welcome to episode 2 of our webinar series. Today we're going to be discussing training volume for the strength athlete. This is going to be a pretty in-depth overview. We're going to go over a lot of different topics, starting with what is training volume. We're going to learn how to calculate training volume, why that's important. We're going to look at why training volume is so important for strength. We'll look at what can influence training volume tolerance. We will discuss some evidence-based volume prescriptions for strength training. And this is where the discussion will get pretty nuanced and actually quite individual, because there aren't really any evidence-based volume prescriptions for strength training, which I thought was really, really cool. And then we'll look at how to adjust training volume over time and why you might want to do that. And then we'll look at a case study of a powerlifter in off-season and in meet prep and what the differences are in those situations. So overarching themes, things to remember, things to point out is nothing exists in a vacuum. So when you change training volume, it will have an impact on other things within your training paradigm. So training volume, training intensity, training frequency, recovery, all of these factors are not individual. They do not exist in silos. They exist within a continuum. They're interdependent. So we need to understand how everything interacts together. I want you to remember that there are outliers to every study and intervention. So when we look at the research will present us with the average. It'll present us with most people, most of the time, respond in this manner. We have to remember that some people didn't respond and some people were absolutely hyper responders. So the gamut of clients that you're going to see throughout your career will run that entire spectrum. This is why data collection is key. So the more information that you have at your disposal, the more accurate your decision-making process can be. And we always want to make decisions based on the evidence. So we all run an evidence-based practice. And that means that we use both experimental, so with the research, and experiential, which means subjective and objective data that we collect on the fly. Our job is to make the decisions, and we need to have a nuanced understanding of all the factors involved in that decision. One of them being the person, right? So we need to coach that person, not just the program. And this is something that I mention all the time, in that training is as much art as it is science. We need to have an understanding of the science, and the way in which we apply that science to the individual is our own personal art. Okay. So what is volume? The volume, simply put, is the cumulative work performed in a training session. The easiest way to calculate volume is your loading times the reps times the sets. So if I do 30 pounds for 10 reps 3 times, that's 300 pounds times 3 sets. That's 900 pounds of volume. Okay. Using this model, volume can escalate quite quickly, simply by adding 10 pounds per set. So if you go from 30 pounds to 40 pounds, you can increase from 900 pounds to 1,200 pounds of volume, essentially adding 30% to your volume just by adding 10 pounds. Okay. Everything you do within a training session could be counted towards volume. And this is where the discussion gets a little bit fishy, because every person will have a different definition of how to calculate volume and how to measure volume. Measuring volume could be including your warm-up sets. So anytime you touch a barbell, it counts towards volume. If you're using ramping sets, so if you have, a top set of 5, if you do sets of 5 all the way up to the top, all of those sets count towards your volume. All your work sets, all your back offs, any sort of like finishers, intensifiers, any conditioning that you do at the end, it all counts towards volume. Even your body weight and band warm-ups, mobility drills, all of that stuff is your body going through loaded ranges of motion. That is volume. Okay. All of this contributes to the accumulation of fatigue. Anyone who has been deep in a meet prep or deep in a show prep knows that as soon as you walk in the room and you start moving, it feels hard. That's because that is contributing to the volume that you're about to perform. Some important terms that we need to understand, and I took these directly from Mike Israetel because I think he does a great job of classifying them. I don't think all of them are important or relevant, but it's important to keep them in front of mind. We have our maintenance volume. So maintenance volume is the least amount of volume you can do and avoid regression. So we're just trying to stay the same. Based on the research, this is quite low. It's actually about 20% of the volume that you would need in order to progress. Maximum recoverable volume. So that's the most amount of volume you can do and still recover from. It's the red line on your RPMs, right? That MRV is that red line. Minimal effective volume. That's the least amount of volume you can do and still make progress. And this is going to be different for every person. For me, my minimal effective volume is a single repetition. I still made progress and I did a single repetition of squat every week for 16 weeks. So you'll see why that makes sense further on. Maximal adaptive volume. This is probably one of the it's probably the most important one. And it actually is a range. So it's the volume range where your best progress can be made. It's somewhere in between MRV, so the maximum amount of volume, and the minimum effective volume. So anything in between that, that's your maximal adaptive volume. And if we look at this on a spectrum from MRV, MAV, and MEV, if I stay in that MAV range, that maximal adaptive volume, if I'm not pushing my red line, do I really need to deload as often? Probably not, because I'm still adapting, right? Do I always need to be pushing towards that MRV to make progress? Maybe, maybe not. My point of view, my personal philosophy is the longer I can go without a deload, the better. So why don't I just stay in that MAV range? Maybe I don't make progress as fast, but it's a more sustainable amount of volume and I can progress longer over time. These are all just questions that you want to ask yourself. Now, calculating training volume, you're going to have to pick a strategy. And in my opinion, the best strategy is all of them. Okay. So you can look at load volume. Load volume is the total amount of weight lifted within a session. So it's the equation I gave you before. Sets, weights, reps. Okay. 3 sets, 30 pounds, 10 reps, 900 pounds. This assumes that there's no impact of training density or modality. So this assumes that sets, weights, reps is consistent across the board, whether it's a bicep curl or a chin up, whether it's a squat or a leg extension, whether it's a barbell squat with tempo or a barbell squat without tempo, right? There's no consideration for nuance here. We can look at set volume, which is something that is very popular in bodybuilding context because it's just the total number of hard sets per session, assuming that every set is to failure or close to. It assumes no impact of absolute or relative intensity because unless that is factored into the volume, it doesn't count. Density or modality. So assuming that your set volume, you would have to make assumptions in these 3 categories. And it assumes every set's created equal, right? So again, a set of leg extension to failure counts as 1 set of quads, as does a squat set to failure. Okay. Next is effective reps. So you could go through your whole program, and this is again more popular in hypertrophy ranges or hypertrophy programs. Count the total number of reps within 3 reps in reserve. So if you have 10 sets and all 10 sets are to failure, that would be 30 effective reps. Actually, it'd be 40 because 3, 2, 1, 0. So it'd be 40 effective reps. It doesn't account for absolute intensity, so the load on the bar, and it doesn't account for modality. So you can see with these 3 strategies, there are limitations to each one. So what you can do is you can actually combine all 3 in your own way, and we'll look at that in the case study. So how do we determine total volume? Well, we could divide it by muscle group. Okay, how do you do that? Well, in the research, they count one set as anything that that muscle is involved in. So if you have, say, 10 sets of back and then 2 sets of biceps, you actually do 12 sets of biceps because your biceps are involved in all your back movements. That's how it's arranged in the research. You could go per movement. So you could split it up into squatting patterns, benching patterns, deadlifting patterns. This is my preferred way to do things as a base. And then I build out to muscle groups. You could also look at the volume per day. So per session, how many sets are you doing? How many movements are you doing? Within the week is probably the best way over time to moderate volume. And then per training cycle, I've never used per training cycle volume considerations because I undulate week to week, but this is something that you could potentially do. Again, the research is scattered and has its limitations. So the populations that they're investigating here, lightly trained or untrained, the durations are very short. So it's usually comparing high volume to low volume, single joint to multi-joint. There's no interaction between interventions. The measures used have very poor standardization. So execution of exercises individual to individual are going to be very variable. And the definitions used, like the definition of volume in one study might be different than the definition of training volume in another study. I saw this a lot when it came to the idea of set volume and standardization of volume across the week. And we'll talk about that a little bit even more. And like I said before, the best option is to be aware of the above concepts and adopt a strategy that accounts for all of them in some way. So we need to know, because we're talking about strength, right? And in the context of powerlifting, we're talking about squatting, bench pressing, and deadlifting. So we need to know what our total volume of the big 3 lifts are. We also have to know how much assistance volume that we're doing. We have to know how that assistance volume is divided by the muscle groups. And we have to know how that volume is contributing to the progression on the main lift, because the progression on the main lift is what's most important to us. So we're trying to find the appropriate recipe, so to speak, that will allow us to continuously progress our squatting, benching, and deadlifting over time through appropriate programming of assistance work within the appropriate amount of volume, within that MAV. Okay. More variables. So the more variables at play, the more data we have, the more accurate our decision-making can be. Is volume even important? And I wanted to put this in here because it is, but to a point, right? So volume is important because we need to have enough exposures to movements in order to get adaptations and strength, but not so many exposures that we can't recover. So we need to be aware of what's considered an exposure, and we need to be aware of the overlap between the specific adaptations, so your squat, bench, and deadlift, and the general adaptations, which is the bodybuilding work, assistance work that comes after the fact. Okay, so that interplay is really important to understand. So adopting a single strategy probably isn't going to be the best. You're going to want to look at the big picture. So what impacts training volume? Now, this was me trying to figure out what impacts training volume on the spot. You could make arguments for other factors, but intrinsically, we have our age, weight, gender, training age, proficiency, absolute strength level, anthropometry, personality, and psychology. You could add in hormone panel as well. Okay, we'll just throw that in there. Extrinsically, we have our lifestyle. So we have sleep, nutrition, stress management. We have our family life, our occupation, physical activity level, the exercise selection within the program, the training frequency, the training variety, the training intensity, all will factor into how much volume we can do over time. Now, let's take this list and let's look at, okay, which one of these are static and which one of these are dynamic? Okay, which one of these can we stabilize and which ones of these are unable to be controlled? So we're always getting older. Our body weight could be static, could be not. Our gender, it's 2022, it could be fluid, right? So let's talk about biological sex here. Little science humor there. Your training age, you're always going to be increasing your training age. Your proficiency should always be going up. Your absolute strength level should also be going up. Your body proportions may change depending on how big the swing in body weight is, but your arms and legs are probably going to stay the same ratio in size or ratio in length. Okay. And your personality and psychology may or may not change. Lifestyle, very much in flux. Family life, very much in flux. Occupation, things can happen. Physical activity level, we might be able to control that to some extent. We have full control over our exercise selection in terms of locus of stability, loading, and velocity. We have full control over our training frequency most of the time, but some people cannot consistently train at certain intervals, right? Because their life gets in the way. Okay. And then we have our training variety, which we control through programming. You can see that the vast majority of the things that impact training volume are dynamic. They are ever changing and they are not within our control in the most part. So using training volume as the sole means of progression is fleeting. We can't do it. Because if the tolerance to the volume changes independent of our control, we cannot drive volume up indefinitely. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to create as stable of an environment as we can in order to manipulate the training to gain progressive overload. Within that progressive overload, we need to factor in that our tolerance for volume and our ability to recover will be in flux. So that's why if we're pushing towards MRV all the time, or maximal recoverable volume, if you play too close to the sun, you're going to get burned. Injuries, frequent deloads, all of these things. So if you're always trying to do the maximal amount of training, you're going to be shooting yourself in the foot. What we want to do is we want to factor in all of these factors and be able to come up with a plan that is somewhere in the middle, that fits somewhere in that middle of they could do it even on their worst week, but it pushes their capacity enough that it challenges them, but not so much that they risk regression. Okay. So we should be tracking all of these in some way. Now, training volume and strength. The SAID principle, specific adaptation to impose demands. In order to maximize the adaptation for maximal strength, we need to train with near maximal weights. Okay? If you want to lift heavy, you got to lift heavy. You need to practice lifting heavy. But this bears the question, right? How often? How much? Like, how heavy is heavy? For how long do we need to practice this? Is there carryover between lighter load training and maximal strength? Well, we know the answer of how often and how much is going to be depending on the individual and their skill level. It'll also be dependent on the time of year. You don't need to be training with singles in the off season. That being said, the more specific your training is, the more it's going to lead to strength adaptations because the SAID principle. So you have to make a value judgment between what's most important for that lifter at that time. The context matters. The carryover between lighter load training and maximal strength, there is. All of these studies discussing training to failure, discussing hypertrophy outcomes, there is usually a measure of strength involved. And strength usually goes up along with those interventions. Does it go up in proportion to similar interventions focused on strength? No. But there is a carryover between hypertrophy rep ranges and strength. Okay, let's not forget that. The research is quite clear that more volume should lead to more strength, assuming it can be recovered from, right? So these are direct quotes from studies, okay? 2 to 3 sets per resistance exercise was associated with 46% greater strength gains than 1 set in both trained and untrained subjects. So more volume, more strength. There's a dose-response relationship between strength, hypertrophy, and sets per week to a point. They've noted a graded dose-response relationship, whereas increases in resistance training volume produced greater gains in muscle hypertrophy. So graded dose-response relationship means that as the dose went up, hypertrophy increased to a point and then it leveled off. So it's more of an increase and then a level off. Okay. With this, they're talking about sets per week. So they're factoring in frequency, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. What we can glean from that is that if we can tolerate more volume, we should be able to get stronger faster. Okay. We know that training with higher absolute loads, so less than 5 rep max, produce more favorable outcomes for strength, but no significant difference in hypertrophy outcomes. What does that mean? Well, that means that to get stronger, you need to lift relatively heavy. But to gain muscle mass, you can do that across a wide range of repetitions. And this is Brad Schoenfeld's research has proven pretty unequivocally, you can build muscle between 3 and 30 reps. Okay, as long as you're not doing doubles and singles all the time, your strength work will elicit some hypertrophy. Okay. Tony would argue this to his death, but because he's working with Sam Buckner, who's debunking a lot of the research, my personal opinion is that hypertrophy increases the muscle's general ability to produce force. And these are quotes from studies, right? Regardless of loading zone, and that high load training additionally leads to superior skill acquisition for dynamic strength testing. There's a lot to pull out of that sentence, okay? The studies on hypertrophy versus strength, so muscle size versus strength, are limited because it takes a long time to acquire the skill needed to display strength. So if I wanted to run a study that built muscle and then got strong, the study would have to be very long. And no one's done that study yet. They've only compared one versus the other. So hypertrophy increases the muscle's general ability to produce force. A bigger muscle has the potential to produce more force, regardless of loading zone. And high loads training additionally leads to superior skill acquisition, right? High load training, specific adaptation. So we need high load training, and it also specifies that strength is a skill, okay? The skill of strength can be improved. This is why we must consider the impact of training load and relative intensity on volume. So if I'm always training heavy, what does that mean? Well, if I'm training for strength, I probably don't want to train to failure because that's going to degrade the skill. So training short of failure favors strength outcomes, and training closer to failure favors hypertrophy outcomes. So this is the question of let's standardize to 15 total reps, okay? We have a set of 8 and a set of 7 at a specific load that are both to failure. Okay, so 2 sets to failure, 15 reps. Or I have 3 sets sub-maximal at that same weight, 15 reps, 3 sets of 5. Which is going to be more fatiguing? We don't know. Okay, so what we need to consider here is that we're training short of failure, but we're training heavy. And we're doing that because we need to maximize skill. And we're maximizing skill because if we're not training to failure, we're not going to have skill degradation. We're not going to have a degrading of the motor pattern. And so we're performing the same movement over and over again. As we reach failure, there will be a degrade in the pattern and the skill acquisition won't be as effective. We must also consider the role of training frequency on volume. And this is something that only recently I have really given credence to. I personally very rarely would increase frequency for people, and now I am seeing a massive benefit to my clients on increasing frequency. Higher training frequencies elicit greater gains in muscle strength, but that's only because higher frequencies in the research were correlated to higher volumes. When the volume was equated, there was not a specific effect on frequency and strength. Okay, so again, 15 total sets during a week, split between 2 days or split between 3 days. As long as it's 15 total sets, the difference in strength was minimal. But frequency allows for more opportunities to get into positions and learn patterns independent of volume. So if I'm squatting 3 times a week, that means I'm getting into squat positions 3 times a week. That means that I'm approaching a squat fully rested 3 times a week, which means that my skill is going to be more refined. If my skill is more refined, I'm likely to get better strength acquisition over time. That makes sense? Now, based on what we just learned about volume and strength, more volume will lead to greater strength gains. More frequency can lend itself to higher volumes. Strength requires a specific high load stimulus. And strength is specific to the task. So if we're talking about powerlifting, we're talking about squatting, bench pressing, and deadlifting. These are internally stabilized, axially loaded movements that are high skill. Okay. If we look at that in a bubble, right? So internally stabilized movements, highly fatiguing. Axially loaded, highly fatiguing. High skill, highly fatiguing. High load, highly fatiguing. Right? So all of that is going to decrease volume tolerance within that lift and within that session and within that week. Non-failure training elicits greater improvements in strength due to skill acquisition. So that means even though it's heavy, it's not to failure. So that's important to remember. It's not to failure. This quote I pulled out because I thought it was really, it paid a lot of respect to the complexity of the situation, okay? So as a consequence of previous imprecision and poor experimental control, conclusions with respect to set number and strength gain are not likely reflective of the specific adaptations resulting from imposed physiological stress. Oh, so making recommendations for set number and strength gains isn't reflective of what's going on? It's not because of the set number and strength gains? Could it be because of the multifactorial nature of adaptation? Right? If we look at the fitness fatigue model or the stress response model, we're looking at a global person, this biopsychosocial person, with whom we've imposed a stress, and that system of stress management of the organism is trying to compensate. So that's why we need to consider the full perspective of an individual, their needs, their capacities, and their global accumulation and management of stress when we talk about tolerance to volume. So to make a recommendation on assigning volume prescriptions for strength, it'd be impossible to do it accurately, and it's impractical. There's no reason why we need to do that. Okay? We need to pay respect to the multifactorial nature of these neurological adaptations involved in the process. MEV, MRV, MV, MAV, they're all concepts that are important to keep in mind, but they should absolutely not govern your decision-making process, especially individual to individual. Intra-individual, you might be able to identify MEV. You might be able to identify MRV. You might be able to look at your programs if you're measuring accurately and say, okay, last time we did this amount of volume, they needed to deload the next week. So I'm prepared for that. But maybe this time they're in a lower stress situation and they can tolerate that amount of volume. Or maybe they're in a higher amount of stress situation and they get hurt. Okay, so we have to be always evaluating the data at our disposal and making good judgments for that person at that time. So, adjusting training volume over time. If volume is a driver for strength gains, then we should aim to do whatever we can to increase it within the maximal adaptive volume. Personally, I think trying to find MRV is dumb. I think it's a waste of time because your MRV is going to be a dynamic number. It's going to be a dynamic thing. Some weeks your MRV is going to be lower, some weeks it's going to be higher. So aiming at a moving target for this gold standard of volume, I think is a waste of time. Does it mean that we constantly need to be pushing volume up? In some situations, you're going to want that. Take, for example, a beginner. You're going to want more volume for that person so they have more practice. But as they get stronger, as they get more proficient, they won't need as much volume because they will be higher skilled and the loads they'll be using will be higher. So initially, you may want to be using volume as a tool to drive up. But there's also an argument to be made for keeping volume static and manipulating the other variables within the training paradigm. Let's again revisit the multifactorial nature of the individual and what's in our control and what's static, what's dynamic. What is dynamic is most things. What's in our control? We can control their nutrition, right? If we're controlling nutrition, we can control their nutrition. We can prescribe amounts of sleep. We can prescribe supplementation. We can prescribe step goals. We can prescribe stress management strategies. We can prescribe recovery modalities. But that goes only so far. Okay. What we need to do is really, again, my personal strategy is I get someone to a point in which the volume tolerance is there, and then I manipulate other variables: intensity, frequency, and density. Okay. Considerations for off-season versus meet prep. So in an off-season, you're going to have more general training. There's going to be less specificity, lower absolute loading, so lighter weights, but more failure training, right? Because we're going to be wanting to focus on hypertrophy. What does this mean for volume needs and tolerance? So if it's more general training, you're probably going to be able to use more externally stabilized variations. There's going to be less specificity, so less barbell work, lower absolute loading, so a little less CNS or peripheral fatigue, a little bit more CNS fatigue because of the failure training. Usually off seasons, you're able to tolerate more volume because there are less internally stabilized movements, more externally stabilized movements, and the training is more variable. So there's less repetition, less fatigue in that manner. During meet prep, specific training. So axially loaded, internally stabilized, high load, high skill, very fatiguing. There's a focus on skill acquisition and execution. So you're going to want to be performing more of your work within the barbell movements, which are the most fatiguing. Frequency will be high, set number will be high. There's higher absolute loading. You're lifting heavier weights. And there is less failure training. So you could look at this and say, I could potentially do the same amount of volume here, but just swap some of the low stuff for the high skill stuff. Like swap some of the machines for the barbell stuff. And that might be a valid swap of volume. And we'll go into the case studies in a moment. But that might be a good adjustment. And then over time, you manipulate that situation to say, all right, I need to pull this out. I need to pull this in. I need to do this based on the needs, based on the context. But in general, during meet prep, you just have a lower tolerance for volume because you're doing more high skill, high load work that's internally stabilized. In the off season, you have less load, less specific, more variety, more external stabilization, and you just have a higher volume tolerance. Usually in the off season too, you're probably at a higher body weight and all those things. So how do we manipulate training over time within that context, right? So there's many strategies that we can use to make sure that we want to finish the off season having increased training volume incrementally. And then from there, as absolute intensities rise, volume tolerance will decrease. So we want the highest starting point we can get. So in the off season, we're slowly driving up volume. And then when we have that switch over towards specificity, we are at a higher point than we were previously. So our runway for progression is longer, right? So we're in a roller coaster, and the longer we can stay climbing that roller coaster, the bigger the drop, the faster we can go. Okay, that's what we're looking to do. Finding a starting point. So frequency, intensity, and volume all need to be considered. You need to pay attention to absolute intensity. So the difference between absolute intensity, relative intensity. Absolute is the actual weight on the barbell. Relative intensity is how close to failure you're training. Okay. Do we want to look at load volume or set volume? Ideally both. We want to look at all of our static variables, and we want to look at our dynamic variables. How can we make sure we have the most static variables possible and minimize the amount of ones outside our control? Then we want to look at how many total sets do we start with. And here's the question that I typed it and I just started laughing. Does the number of sets you start with really matter? No, it doesn't. Because if they can tolerate it, you can just increase it. So we'll go over some general recommendations in the next slide, I think. But we just have to remember that where we start doesn't dictate where we finish. How we manipulate the training over time is going to dictate where we go. That starting point is exactly that. It's just a starting point. It's just the start gun, right? We start running our race. So you can increase volume linearly, right? So as we increase volume, we can increase the number of sets with a static load, or we can increase the load with a static volume. That's going to drive up load volume. If we're trying to drive up set volume, we can do this linearly, just increase the number of sets, or we can undulate, which is something that I like to do. So alternate increases in volume, load, or intensity. And what this does, it allows for us to manipulate the training density. Whenever I mention training density, it's essentially the amount of load volume within the set number of, within a specific number of sets. So if I do 3 sets of 5, and then I do 3 sets of 5 heavier the next time, the density of that 3 sets of 5 went up. It makes sense? So essentially what we're trying to do is, in that situation, is we're keeping volume constant and we're raising load and intensity, which raises the density of that 3 sets. Undulating essentially means going from like 3 sets to 2 sets, or 3 sets of 3 to 3 sets of 5, then back to 3 sets of 3, then back to 3 sets of 5. So we undulate volume in terms of load volume, and then we use that to manipulate the density of those 3 sets, and so on and so forth. That's the strategy that I prefer because it provides a bit more novelty for the client. And implementing deloads. So a deload, just to define it right off the bat, is we're decreasing volume, intensity, or both to decay fatigue and free up recovery resources for the next bout of training. It can be implemented preemptively, which is what a lot of coaches will do. They'll say, okay, we're going to train for 5 weeks, then deload regardless of if you need one or not. Or it can be on an as needed basis based on the subjective and objective measures and feedback. Personally, I used to do the first. I used to do the former, preemptively deload people every 5 weeks. It was usually every 4th week. What I saw was you end up wasting time, because if that person doesn't need to deload and you're within that MAV, you could train 8, 10, 12 weeks without needing a deload, as long as you're just a bit more moderate with it. So instead of taking 3 steps forward, 1 step back, you can take 12 half steps forward and no steps back, and you're twice as far along. That makes sense. So first and foremost, for adjusting training volume, we need to be tracking variables. So we need to know, is this person progressing or regressing in their performance? Are their load volumes actually going up? So if you have 3 sets of 5 at an RPE of 8 in 1 week, and then the next time you revisit that 3 sets of 5 at an 8 in the next week, are they doing more weight? Plain and simple. Are the weights on their assistance work going up, or have they plateaued? Can they push their logbook anymore? That's why it's so important to have a logbook. We can look at subjective measures. So mood, energy, motivation, perceived stress. Usually having some sort of communication back and forth between you and your client subjectively is important. You could even use a questionnaire on a weekly basis if that's what you'd like to do. Then we look at objective measures like nutrition, sleep, steps. Are those in check? We can look at performance, right? How they're performing in the gym. Is their movement proficiency improving? Is their execution getting better? Are they getting more comfortable day to day with the load, or with the training load in total, right? The amount of training that they're doing. There's an argument here for biofeedback using things like resting heart rate or HRV. Personally, I haven't seen that being necessary ever. And I've coached NFL players, I've coached, CFL players, I've coached high-level powerlifters. It's nice information to have, but very rarely does a poor HRV score correlate with poor performance. It's usually an after-the-fact situation where it has a poor performance. We look back, oh, your HRV was low. But the number of times that happens versus wakes up with a high HRV, has a great training session, it's not even close. What you'd want to look at more so is those subjective measures of motivation, mood, things of that nature. The line that I always like to use, it doesn't matter what something says you feel like, it matters what you feel like, right? It doesn't matter if you wake up with a low HRV. If you're highly motivated to train and you're excited to get after it, you're probably going to have a good workout. Okay. So now some general guidelines for volume based on what we know. So once we're tracking all these variables, once we have all the information at our disposal, we're going to want to start on the low end based on the initial information available. So based on your initial questionnaire, which takes into account all of these variables that you'll get an idea of from your initial intake form, you're going to start on the low end. And we're going to focus on our statics and dynamics. We're going to try to only manipulate one training variable at a time, maybe 2. Okay. But we want to know that if we made a change and an outcome happened, we want to be able to point back to the variable that we changed and say, that's what did it. Okay. Start where you are, maximize intensity and density. So maximize output as hard as you can within the given volume being performed. Once that's maximized and they're pushing and they plateau, add volume based on the needs. So if they need more squat volume, perhaps they need more exposures to get more proficient. We need to squat more often. Let's add some squat. If you want to keep volume the same in that regard, maybe you add some squat and take away something else, right? But we need to make sure that if we're adding volume, it's where they need the volume. From there, maximize intensity and density. Drive up performance. Let's see how hard they can push. From there, once you've increased volume slightly, we might want to look at increasing frequency without changing volume. Okay, that's going to be a call that you have to make. Usually my range is like, if I'm doing more than 6 to 8 sets of a competition movement in a session, in my opinion, you're better off splitting that session. 6 to 8 sets of squats, benches, or deadlifts is a lot. Okay. Once we've increased frequency without changing volume, let's maximize intensity and density, because if we're increasing frequency, we likely don't have as high of a recovery demand for each session because each session is shorter. So we can drive up our intensity and density again. Then we're going to be able to repeat this process of increasing volume incrementally based on the needs and then maximizing intensity and density. There will come a point where volume and intensity don't cooperate. So you've got your volume up to a certain point and intensity has risen. Usually that's going to be in the form of absolute load. So absolute load has come up, and a great example, I'll use one of myself. I was squatting 3 times a week. It was going great. I was making great progress. Then all of a sudden, all 3 of my squats in the week were over 500 pounds. Old Paul's hips did not like that. Right? So what do we do? Well, I know that I'm within my intensity ranges for all 3 of those sets or all 3 of those workouts. What do I do? Well, it's going to depend on the needs and what the goals are moving forward. Maybe my volume needed to come down. Maybe I need to decrease the number of sets I was doing on each day. Maybe I needed to eliminate a day, right? These are all strategies that could have offloaded volume and allowed me to continue to progress. Because increasing volume isn't the only tool you have to increase load, increase progression. All right. Do we have any questions about anything that we discussed so far? No? Okay. So let's look at some case studies. I put in some references here. I've uploaded the lecture to the Kajabi site, so it's up there for you. Let's go to... Okay, so here is weeks 10, 12, and 13 of an off season. So what we see is we have escalating triples 1 week, escalating 5s the next week. 3 sets, 3 sets. Then we have 2 sets at the top set from week 10, then 2 sets at the top set from week 11. So we drop the set off, but increase the intensity. The progressions on the other lifts, on the progression on the squat is the same as the progression on the deadlift. The progression on the bench, bench and squat are the same progression. The deadlift progression is static sets, so 4 sets, increasing density. So we went top set of 3, then 3 by 3 at 90, top set of 5, 3 by 5 at 90. Then I went 2 sets of 3 at the top set from week 10, and then I dropped the set off the down work and increased the percentage by 2.5. I did the exact same thing the next week. The following week would have been 3 by 3, 3 by 1, or sorry, 1 by 3 at 95. And then finally, the next progression would have been 4 sets of 3 at week 10's top set. So in this one, the number of sets, 4, stayed static. The amount of volume done at the top set from the first progression increased. So the density of those 4 sets went up. Okay, a little bit different progression. What we see here is I calculated the movement volume, the frequency, which stayed static, and the set volume per week of each muscle group. So squat went 12, 12, 11, 11, then back up to 12, 12 on that. It would have been 12, 12 on the next week. Deadlift went, bench went 14, 14, 13, 13. Deadlift stayed static at 7. So how did I get 7 deadlifts? 4 sets here, 2 sets of B stance RDL, which is a deadlift assistance movement for me, and then 1 set of a 2-inch deficit deadlift. 7 total sets of deadlift. How did I get my 12 sets of squat? 3 sets here, 2 sets here, that's 5. Belt squat, 2 sets, that's 7. Split squats, that's 3 sets, 10. 3 sets, that's 13. Ooh. I missed one. I counted something else. 3, 5, 7, 10. Yeah, 13. Okay, so 13, 12, 12. Sorry, guys. Okay. Then deadlift, or we went over the deadlift already. So chest, chest is going to be all of our benching plus any additional chest work we did. So in this one, we had some dumbbell incline press. Okay. Back, any deadlifting, any rowing. You could count squats in there too if you really wanted to be specific about back, right? Because erectors. Shoulders, any pressing, any direct shoulder work. Triceps, any pressing, any direct tricep work. Biceps, any direct bicep work, any rowing. Quads, any squats, any direct quad work. So if we look at the volume recommendations for hypertrophy, 8 to 20 sets. Look at that. 8 to 20 sets. I put in here 10 to 14 for hamstrings. It just depends if you want to count squats as hamstrings. Okay, so that's what I factored in there. But if we look at this, all of the hypertrophy ranges, 8 to 20 reps, they're all met. We're doing enough volume within the week to elicit optimal hypertrophy. On these, we're manipulating volume in terms of the set volume to accommodate the intensity of those sets. There's many progressions we can use. And I think doing I did an entire presentation on how to manipulate a 5x5. So there are infinite numbers of ways to drive up, to progressively overload a set number of sets, or to add intensity as you decrease sets and then add them back in. So this is an undulating approach using 5 3s, 5s, 3s. So the absolute intensity is going to vary week to week. The set volume on the deadlift remains static. But the other thing that you'll notice is the assistance volume also remains static. So other than that one set that we dropped off for the bench press, up here, whoops. Other than the one set that we dropped off on the bench press and the squat, these stay the same because statics and dynamics. I want to keep everything static as I change the variables. So the assistance volume doesn't change. The only thing that I changed week to week was the bench, deadlift, and squat. The secondary benching, squatting, and deadlifting may or may not change, but again, it's still benching. So I still did 3 sets here on the 3-second comp bench. I did 3 sets, 3 sets, 3 sets, 3 sets. Didn't change. The intensity changed because the intensity of earlier in the week changed. But one thing that I do is I do not, in the off season, I do not change assistance volume. I find a good range and I keep it there. Adding novelty is very simple. For example, say I wanted to change up the assistance work on this first bench day. I could easily change hack squats to a pendulum squat. I could easily change incline dumbbell press to an incline Smith machine press, or an incline or a flat dumbbell press, right? It's the same pattern of movement, more or less. I don't need to change the volume recommendations. Now, say I'm transitioning into meet prep, which we'll see in a second, and I change these hack squats to a front squat. Well, now I'm axially loaded. Now I'm internally stabilized. Is my total weekly squat volume going to have to change? Is a set of 8 to 12 to failure equal to a free weight barbell movement done sub failure? I don't think so. I think the internal stabilization is way more fatiguing. So we need to factor this in, and we need to know how that people respond. I adopted a very similar strategy here when we transition into the meet prep situation. So this is 5 weeks or 6 weeks to 2 weeks. Okay. We'll just look at this side first. So week 6 went 9, 12, 6. We kept the frequency the same from off season to prep. Okay. Frequency, I don't usually mess with unless there's issues. Okay. Because some people just respond better and need more practice. You see this actually more so in drug-free lifters, need a little bit more practice than enhanced lifters. But again, that could be a whole webinar in itself. So 9 squats, 12 benches, and 6 deadlifts. We went 4, 4, 3. The next week, same. Next week, same. Next week, we went to some singles and doubles. So the volume came down by 30%, almost 30%. So we went from 9 to 6, 12 to 10, 6 to 4. At 2 weeks out, we dropped even more. We went to 4 sets of squat, 8 sets of bench, and 4 sets of deadlift. So we dropped more. Absolute intensity comes up, volume goes down. The other thing you'll notice is there's way less assistance work here. So we're offloading assistance work volume. You went from 14, 14, 16 to 14, 14, 16 to 14, 14, 16, and then a steep drop off, 12, 12, 12, 8, 8, 8. All we're doing right there is as absolute intensity rises, we're trying to increase our recovery because less of our work can be done on those. Like there's less recovery capacity available for the bodybuilding work. So we offload it and we free up recovery resources for those main lifts. So all you're doing over the course of that prep, so this was 5 weeks of prep. This volume up here would have been relatively static. And it actually was, even as we got into doubles and singles, until we started playing with attempts. So weeks 7, 8, 9, 10, likely for me, would have been static up here. I wouldn't have changed a thing. I just would have changed the density of the sets performed. So we would have done either more work at those rep maxes. So you can see here, I might have done 2 sets of 4 and 1 set of 5. But it would still be 3 sets. It's not until I start playing with attempts that I start dropping the number of sets, but I will start dropping assistance volume as I need to accommodate the heavier weights. Okay. This is all relating to this specific individual. I purposefully chose an off season and a prep for the same person to show you that not much changes in terms of volume as we progress from off season to prep. I have done, so if we go back to the off season, so I have done similar progressions to this where we go like 1 set of 3, 3 sets of 3, 2 sets of 3, 2 sets of 3, 3 sets of 3, 1 set of 3, 4 sets of 3, and you're done. Then repeat, right? Because if I can do 4 sets of 3 at a previous top set, I should be able to exceed that top set of 3 the next time I go do it. Very simple progression. If I run through this as a linear progression, 60% for 10 for 4 sets, 62.5 for 10 for 4 sets, 65 for 9 for 4 sets, and just periodically just increase week to week, increase 2.5% while decreasing the number of reps. That's totally valid. The volume comes down, total number of reps comes down. Oh, sorry, there's a question. I didn't see it. So Dalton says the undulating approach is also great for the athlete who wants to compete against themselves in training. I absolutely love the idea of creating competition within the training session, to creating these benchmarks that people can look to achieve and make sure that they have some level of baseline performance that they must exceed. It's important to communicate in that regard that you won't be able to exceed it all the time, but having that at your disposal is incredibly valuable just as a benchmark to shoot for. You just have to have the maturity level to say, oh, not there today. So that was quite a bit of information to throw at you. Some take-home themes for today really are, you need to have as much information at your disposal as you can when making decisions. Okay, so the more variables you can track within the training, the better off you're going to be long-term making decisions. The next is find that recipe that works for that client in terms of total amount of volume and MAV. So that maximal adaptive volume range, and stay there. Don't fuck with it. Okay. The only time you fuck with it or mess with it, sorry, I shouldn't swear, we're on a webinar, is when there is a need. So if you're watching their training process and they're getting stronger week to week and everything's looking good, they're not getting hurt, they're making progress, why would you change anything? Right? It's the old nutrition thing. It's like, oh, you're losing weight, no changes. Oh, but I'm dieting, I should be, no changes. As soon as you see regressions, well, you're probably looking at a poor recovery. So you can do two things. You can either decrease the volume on a couple of different exercises and see if you can push that progression a little further, or deload them. Take a deload and then get right back into it. That might be all you need. The big thing here is that we're trying to only change one or two variables at a time. So in this paradigm for me, I keep my assistance work static across the board, and I manipulate the intensity and the density of those top sets on the competition lifts. In prep, I will drop off assistance volume as needed to accommodate for the increase in intensity. Intensity is static in the off season. I'm going to say that again. Intensity is static in the off season because the weights don't change. Your 3-rep, your top set of 3, your top set of 5, they don't change. You just do more sets of them. It's clicking now. It's clicking now. So if I'm keeping my intensity static, well, that's one variable I'm not changing. So let's increase the density there. So this is a density strategy, but assistance volume doesn't change. If I was using an intensity strategy here, I may not be able to keep my assistance volume the same because the need to increase intensity might require additional recovery resources, which would impact my ability to tolerate more assistance volume. That's why we save intensity progressions for prep. Off season should be about performing the most amount of work possible to create the biggest runway possible we can for progression. I think that's it. I think that's all I got. I am open to any and all questions because that was a lot. Again, I actually uploaded this Google Sheet as well to the file. So if you guys want to check that out and see it for yourself, let me know. Here's all the nerd stuff that we went over. But yeah, anything, any questions, feel free to ask. If not, I bid you adieu.
No, nothing from me. That was great. No, thank you for that.
No problem. Dalton, you good? Oh, he's probably training.
Yeah, no,
No, you're good?
pretty good on this so far. The webinar.
Awesome.
Be insightful.
Sweet. Well, I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. And if you have any recommendations for webinars that you'd like to see in the future, just let us know.